region's fault lines have shifted in ways that are now visible in both the negotiating rooms and on the water. What started as a series of indirect engagements and quiet back channels has begun to look like a contest over who actually speaks for Tehran and over who holds the levers of escalation. In recent weeks, that contest has taken on a sharper shape. Iran's paramilitary leadership has not only tightened its grip on battlefield decisions, but has also stepped forward into the architecture of diplomacy, asserting authority over Revolutionary Guard Corps. On March 1st, 2026, Iran appointed Ahmad Vahidi to lead the IRGC, a move that placed a longtime cleric, military figure at the apex of an organization that already doubles as a political force and an independent military actor. Vahidi's elevation matters because the IRGC in recent years has evolved from a powerful institution into an axis of decision-making that can, and now often does, set policy that the civilian apparatus must accept or negotiate around. Dynamics have been on display in Islamabad, where proximity talks intended to reduce the risk of a wider conflagration instead exposed an uneasy duality inside Tehran. Pakistani mediation opened a rare channel between Washington and Tehran, but Iranian negotiators arrived in the Pakistani capital accompanied by, and in some accounts guided by, senior IRGC figures. That unusual arrangement, military leaders sitting alongside or even above diplomats at the table, reflected a deliberate choice by Tehran's security command to ensure that battlefield gains, missile thresholds, and maritime posture would not be subject to concessions made without its direct approval. Analysts who track the shadow lines of influence argue that this is not accidental. The IRGC is asserting that wartime strategy and any possible compromises must be aligned with its operational imperatives. criticalthreats.org/the ttps://double/analysis/Iran-update-evening-special-report-April-182026 UTeam_source. The result was a set of meetings that, even at their best, produced ambiguous signals. On one hand, there have been public and private acknowledgements from Iran's diplomatic rank about the potential for conditional steps to reduce tensions. On the other hand, action by armed units, particularly in and around the Strait of Hormuz, has often undercut those signals. The consequence is a diplomatic theatre in which words of flexibility are issued even as the instruments of force continue to operate under a parallel chain of sea. Oman. For foreign interlocutors, that creates the practical problem of negotiating with more than one authority, the ministry on paper and the commanders who command weapons and maritime control. The Sufansitor.org/TTT-PS://the-Sufansitor.org/Intel-brief-2026-April-10 This parallel power structure also intersects with a major structural change UT. Inside Iran, the country's succession at the top of the clerical hierarchy. In late February and early March of this year, Iran moved through a rapid and consequential transfer of authority in the office that formally sits above all others. The assembly that oversees succession named a new supreme leader in early March, and observers note the new leader's closer institutional ties to the Revolutionary Guard than his predecessors, a shift that further concentrates power in networks allied with the IRGC. That context helps explain why military actors feel both emboldened and entitled to sit at negotiating tables that US now were the exclusive domain of career diplomats and political ministers. appnews.com//appnews. By https://appnews.com https://appnews live IE9 351H ESE9 35 4145 AE 935 141 83 FFE 53 FFE 53 FFF UTime_source equals OpenEye on the water. These choices have a direct and immediate impact. Control of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage through which a substantial portion of the world's oil supply transits, has become a bargaining chip, and one that the IRGC can wield in a way civilian diplomats cannot always constrain. Tehran's rhetoric about maritime control has at times been matched by operational behavior, restrictions on shipping, aggressive interdiction of transits, and attacks on vessels that foreign governments and commercial interests have long relied upon being free to move. When messages from diplomats say one thing and vessels are struck or denied passage by forces acting under IRGC direction, the inconsistency does not look like mere miscommunication. It looks like a domestic hierarchy in which military imperatives trump diplomatic messaging. houseofsword.com/Isargc-Strikes-Saudi-Energy-Slamabad-talks-Kuwait-Condemns-Iran?_openite. That divergence is not limited to Tehran. In Yemen, Houthi leadership has been explicit about the leverage maritime choke points give them and their allies. A senior Houthi official in Sana'a warned that the group could move to close the Bab al-Mandeb Strait if certain regional pressures continue, a statement framed as a strategic warning designed to influence policy choices far beyond Yemen's borders. The Bab al-Mandeb controls access from the Red Sea into the Gulf of Aden, a choke point essential to commercial shipping between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Its closure would force a costly and time-consuming rerouting around southern Africa, with dramatic implications for energy and trade flows. That threat against Bab al-Mandeb compounds the risks that come from Persian Gulf disruption, and together the two make for a global maritime environment in which insurers, shipping lines, and purchasing nations must all reprice risk in real time. terrorisminfo.org https://www.terrorism-info.org.il/info-autosen/admin ?UTMAS. Those choices carry consequences that ripple through markets, policymaking capitals. One immediate effect is the practical difficulty of guaranteeing the security of commercial shipping without risking wider escalation. Western naval coalitions have long argued they can keep sea lanes open. Iran and its partners have countered the geography and asymmetric tactics, fast attack craft, mines, and long-range strike capabilities. Complicates that effort. The political calculus on both sides is forked. A closure or even a credible threat of closure spikes oil prices, stresses economies, and can create incentives for third parties to intervene, with all of that creating reasons for both restraint and escalation. The central reality on which all parties must now reckon is that control over seas and seaways has become, at least partially, a lever of policy. Not a mere extension of grand strategy, but a tool deployed in the moment to shape outcomes. Sion3ersing.com https://ziyon3.rsezing.com/shan-2461 8730/latest.php U2_source=OpenEye. The United States, for its part, is confronting that reality under a new administration. The White House in Washington is led by President Donald J. Trump, who returned to the office on January 20th, 2025. That political context matters for how Washington calculates both deterrence and diplomacy. Leadership changes the tone and thresholds for action, and it shapes the choices of allies in the region who look to American commitments for reassurance. For Iranian strategists and for allied non-state actors such as the Houthis, the disposition of the US president and his stated willingness to protect shipping lanes are variables to be tested and perhaps exploited. Porthouse.gov https://www.whitehouse.gov/releases/202/6/02/president-true. BAMPS, Peace Through Strength, Renew an American Leadership and Global Security /YouTube_source=OpenEye. Inside Tehran, rhetoric has hardened alongside legislative and military measures. Parliamentary committees and security councils have discussed formalizing an intelligent control system for Hormuz. Language that signals not only the conceptualization of state control over the Strait, but an intent to bind that control into domestic law and operational doctrine. That is more than talk. The institutionalization of maritime control, combined with an IRGC that has real operational autonomy, creates governance that can be enforced by force if political leaders choose to convert policy into action. The result for negotiators is clear. Any diplomatic offer that does not secure IRGC assent may be insufficient because the force on the water has the means to undercut or reverse an agreement in practice. houseofsalt.com http://houseofsalt.com/IRGC-strikes-saudi-energy-islamabad-talks-kuwait-com. Demzirin/uterm_source=openeye. Against that institutional backdrop came remarks by a senior official whose language was as direct as it was telling about Iran's posture. He articulated a narrative many in Tehran now promote, that Western actors, and in particular the United States, are unreliable partners, that American public claims of dialogue cannot be trusted, and that military pressure is both a cause and a consequence of the choices made by Washington. Those words were not hedged. They were an assertion of grievance and a claim of agency that resonates inside Iran's security community. The speaker said in part, Americans are truly untrustworthy and unreliable in their dealings. For as long as we can possibly remember and recall from the very beginning, at least since the glorious victory of our revolution, right up to the present moment, in no single scenario have the Americans ever remained faithful to their covenants or their solemn commitments. He said, "It is the Americans themselves who are in fact causing us to witness these very kinds of behaviors." He said, "America does not possess the power to blockade Iran. Why do we imagine that the Americans have blockaded us now?" He said, "This is nothing short of an act of piracy, a clear maritime aggression, and naturally it has already received this decisive response, and it will certainly continue to receive it, perhaps even more than that." He said, "Today the Americans were forced to evacuate the bases they had established in the Persian Gulf region. They had to flee, to abandon the area, to completely withdraw. This achievement is indeed a very significant one. America's prestige was shattered." He said, "We have prepared our expert opinions, the proposed initiative, the intelligent control system for the Strait of Hormuz, and the plan for sustainable security and development of the Strait of Hormuz. Language that signals both a policy program and a justification for firm control. These passages reveal the worldview now circulating at senior levels, that maritime leverage, legislative cover, and the backing of armed forces together make a credible and coercive posture. Fricadalthreats.org, FERTS.org/double/analysis/Iran-update-report-April-April, which me. For countries that depend on these routes, from China and India to the European Union, the stakes are concrete. Shipping companies are already recalibrating routes. Insurers are raising premiums, all pulling cover in risky corridors, and oil and gas markets remain jittery. That means that diplomatic developments are not merely political theatre, they feed directly into markets, into supply chains, and into the daily calculations of businesses whose margins and schedules depend on predictable transit. Brief disruptions can cascade into price shocks and logistical headaches that take months to unwind. In that environment, even the suggestion that blockades or closures are possible has outsized economic consequences. DIY_Jane-24611/Jane-2461873/latest.php?uterm_source=openeye. So how does one negotiate when the entity across the table does not have full control of its own instruments of coercion? That question has become the central puzzle for diplomats who thought they were dealing with ministries and elected officials and now confront a hybrid system where a paramilitary organization can both fight and veto. For Washington and its partners, the practical answer has to be multi-track. Maintain channels with civilian negotiators, create clear communication lines to reduce the chance of miscalculation at sea, and press for verifiable, enforceable measures that bind operational actors. Not only promises on paper, For Tehran's rivals, the answer is both deterrence and diplomacy. Demonstrate capacity and willingness to keep lanes open while remaining open to bargains that reduce incentives to weaponize maritime trade. The alternative is a check. Chronic environment of low-level coercion, punctuated by occasional escalations that are costly for everyone. TheSouFundCenter.org, https://thesouFundCenter.org/intelbrief-2026-April-1/UT_UT_. The region has entered a phase in which power inside states and influence across borders are rearranging themselves in real time. The mix of a paramilitary organization with deep political reach, a newly installed supreme leadership, aligned closely with those forces, and non-state actors able to threaten choke points creates multiple overlap zones of risk. That makes diplomacy harder because it must now be designed to bridge institutions and compel behavior at sea. It also makes strategy riskier because military actions that once could be compartmentalized are now more likely to have immediate strategic consequences. If the goal is to reduce the chance of wider war, then the task is to build a credible mechanism that ties words to actions and empowers interlocutors to N-condemn force, interlocutors to N. Force those actions, and to do so before a spark in the narrow waters of a strait becomes a regional conflagration with global repercussions. wiki.ahmad_vahidi.org/wiki/ahmad_vahidi?, UTIM_source equals OpenEye. There are no easy fixes. Any effective solution will require parties to accept uncomfortable trade-offs. Limits on freedom of action at sea by those who believe control gives them strategic advantage, and reciprocal guarantees from international coalitions who must show they can keep sea lanes open without provoking the very escalation they seek to deter. In the meantime, the world watches as seaways and sovereignty, diplomacy and force, law and coercion all collide in narrow straits and crowded negotiating rooms. The choices made in those spaces in the coming weeks and months will determine whether commerce continues with manageable risk or whether a regional contest reshapes the global economy in ways that will be hard to reverse.